We couldn't move, if you remember, for ministers jumping up and down in the snow of Norway, etc.
What lessons might be learned by sending one of these flagships into shark-infested custard, which might prove to be folly.
This was a football match or a rugby match. America, won 11-0 or whatever. And if it was rugby, 80-90-0. But the war isn't over.
The irony here would be that Trump's very aggressive America First policy, dismissing everybody else, just shows the value of diplomacy, but with your friends and your enemies, because you never know when you might need help. Well, good morning, Greg. Welcome to another edition of The High Ground.
Morning, Sean. You've been busy, I know, but it's good to see you on this telly instead of my other one.
Well, yeah, with the Iran war, it's sort of dominating, isn't it? But, we seem to be less dynamic there and certainly more settling into the diplomacy, although as of the day of recording, obviously, there's still lots of stuff going on out there. But what I was quite interested in focusing on here was that we're trying not to just be news hounds, aren't we? We're trying to also make sure we look at air power in the round. And one of the things that cropped up, I think it was last month, the Russian submarines were loitering around some of the critical infrastructure, national infrastructure around the country, about some of the pipelines and stuff like that. I listened to the Defence Secretary, John Healey, sort of call out the Russians. This is what John Healey had to say.
And I'm making this statement to call out this Russian activity. And to President Putin, I say, we see you. We see your activity over our cables and our pipelines. And you should know that any attempt to damage them will not be tolerated and will have serious consequences.
I was particularly struck by the fact that he said, we're watching, we're seeing you, and if you mess with stuff, there'll be consequences. And it felt a really veiled threat because, first of all, I suspect the Russians were just doing reconnaissance at this stage, and test to see whether we can see what they're doing and how much notice they get, and. But it felt like we've got to wake up to this submarine threat. And why is that important for air and space power? Because actually, the Poseidon aircraft is an absolutely vital part of that. So before we get to the detail, what was your take on some of this story, the credibility of it? Why should we why should we be paying interest to it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult world, isn't it? I mean, it understandably is out of sight, out of mind to a degree, and what goes on down there. And you and I have both got mates who've been in the submarine force with all the tales that they tell. So it's a murky world down there with all sorts of activity going on that we're clearly not all privy to. So I guess we need to take John Healey's words on their merit. If you go back a little bit in time, if you remember, Keir Starmer made quite a statement at the Munich Security Conference where he made the big announcement about the Prince of Wales heading north to the High North. And it's very much on an ASW type mission, although we'll talk about whether that's the right platform for that job. But the whole idea prior to the Iran war was that the High North was our focus, largely because of that submarine threat. It's the Iran war, if you like, that's kind of thrown us off a little bit here. And distracted what was the original UK sort of main line of pursuit.
No, I agree, and I think the other thing for me is, as a sort of relatively regular visitor to Ukraine, you go through Poland, and the Polish are spending a lot of money on the moment on defence, but they are largely feeling the heat of the Russian invasion, and therefore focused on how do you build a big barricade on the border? How do you slow down any potential advance of a land grab into Poland because of history? And we don't feel that same heat, hundreds, maybe 1,000 miles away in the UK. What we tend to forget, though, is that the Russian threat to us isn't via land, it's via sea. And whether it was, back in World War II, most of our stuff, I think it's over 90% of our trade travels by sea. It may be slow, and that's why when the German submarines in World War II caused havoc with the convoys coming across the water. And unless we take that threat seriously, it isn't just about critical national infrastructure. And I think the important thing for me is that, whilst we see the hunt for Red October and all this sort of thing, and it's lots of submarines and clandestine stuff that, as you and I know, it's really fascinating, but most of it's well beyond top secret. The Air Force does have an absolutely pivotal role in this, which is the Poseidon, isn't it? So one of the things that's really interesting visiting Bryson, we were very privileged to chat to some of the crews involved. Here's what they said about what the importance of the Poseidon was.
So we find ourselves in the cockpit of one of these amazing aircraft. For the people who've never, it looks full of high-tech equipment, but what's the role of this aeroplane? In simple terms, what does it do?
So the Poseidon MRA-1 is a maritime reconnaissance and attack aircraft. It is based on the American P-8 Poseidon. It's effectively the same airframe, and its roles are varied, mainly in the maritime role. We do ASW, anti-submarine warfare, ASUW, anti-surface unit warfare, as well as elements of search and rescue, overland, and the multi-mission aircraft role within the Royal Air Force.
So I'm old enough and ugly enough now that I joined in the Cold War, and we were really worried about the submarine threat. We seem to focus a lot on anti-submarine warfare. There was a lot of dedicated platforms. There seems to be a big gap since the end of the Cold War till now, when we've still done it, but it's not been quite the same priority. Now, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it feels like it's very topical. The continent of Europe is focused on Russia, but Russia has got a big maritime force. Are we seeing a greater requirement in the military for this sort of capability?
So I think this requirement's never really gone away. It's just not really talked of. Submarines, it's a very clandestine, very quiet world. The threat's still there. The fact that we have, in recent years, replaced our Trafalgar-class submarines with Astute classes. We have recommitted to the continuous at-sea deterrent. We're keeping on doing this, and maritime is becoming even more prevalent when you consider the Shadow Fleet, what's been going on with the fleet in the Baltic, the Nord Stream pipeline, etc. It's never really gone away. I think now, being in the media more and having a new maritime patrol aircraft come to service in the last 6 years, people are just starting to realise we need maritime still. You have to remember, of course, the Nimrod went out of service over 16 years ago. I was actually at the start of my RAF career on Nimrods. And in the meantime, people have naturally retired, they've left to other fleets, and we're having to regrow that capability almost literally from seed corn again, with expertise brought in from other nations where people did tours abroad. We've had to have our own sovereign capability come through. And now it's an incredible space where we've had individuals who've been in the Air Force for fewer than 4 years and now leading their own team within the aircraft, or even being the mission commander or aircraft commander of a frontline warfighting aircraft.
Because one of the worries, I've never done this role, so I bow to your expertise, but certainly the old Nimrod guys said that it was one thing learning how to do anti-submarine warfare. It was quite another to learn the black art, because it wasn't easy. Clearly, we can't go into the secret side of this, but there was a lot of experience and expertise needed to convert the equipment into real expertise. That must be still true in a way. So how do you build that experience back up again?
We have some incredible people in the training system who have an astounding corporate knowledge of how to do ASW, to look at all the various screens. I'm a pilot by background. Look at all the screens of a submarine and its signatures, obviously well above the scope of this interview. And looking at, as I mentioned, someone who is barely 24, they're looking at the images on the screen and they have to work out what the submarine's doing, and it's quite an undertaking for them. We're growing the force, we're building the expertise, and it will just get better and better with time.
Can you give us a sort of a quick flavour of why that's an important asset in this particular fight?
Yeah, I mean, you almost need to sort of try and get your head around how submarines function and where they function. I mean, your point about trade, and let's be honest, we've seen in the Straits of Hormuz how quickly an interruption of sea lanes or particular choke points occur. And submarines are designed to cause havoc in those types of areas. Of course, it's not just that as well. We need to be very wary of the missiles that a submarine can launch against the mainland of the UK, which is why we need to be extremely focused on that threat. Not forgetting, of course, ultimately that's where the nuclear threat largely lies, particularly for the UK. Why is air so important? Well, you can only chase so many submarines with so many surface ships, and we all know the state of our surface fleet right now isn't as good as it could be. But actually, it's the speed and the distance that you need to cover to search for a submarine in what is effectively an ocean. I mean, it's a large piece of real estate, although submarines can do some of that, surface ships can do some of that. What is so critical is to pinpoint where they are in the first place, and that's where the P8s come in. laying their sonar buoys, building a picture of a much larger piece, which can then zero in those surface assets and the helicopters and all the other assets that are then able to really target the submarine, within a few feet. Whereas the P8 is looking to really build that picture over thousands of square kilometres.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? That we'll get a guest in eventually to try and talk about this stuff, but inevitably, whenever I ended up doing some research on this topic, you end up with the shutters come up, because so much of the submarines, their world is they want to run covertly. That the whole science of submarines is that try and make sure that nobody can track you, that you have very, very quiet engines, that the propeller doesn't cavitate at all, so that you don't make any sounds there, that you lie on the bottom for long periods of time, which is why nuclear submarines that generate their own water, air, and everything like that are so vital. And of course, as soon as you have got them in your sights, they want to get away. And of course, therefore, tracking them to do that, I think, is so vital. I spent some time holding with one of the Nimrod squadrons many years ago, and sitting in the back of this thing as it flew loads and loads of these patterns at low level over the sea, throwing sonar buoys out. Fascinating, watching how do they decide where these sonar buoys should go. They just listen. Sometimes they listen and ping, just trying to work out where the submarine's going, and just tracking it, and therefore calling other assets in. And of course, as soon as you've found these submarines, you don't have to target them. I think it's Mark 54 torpedoes that the Poseidon aircraft has that can carry. But to be brutally honest, as soon as you've found these submarines, as soon as they know they've been found, they sort of panic then, because that's when their security is gone. But I think, as you say, I think we've got 9 Poseidon aircraft now. I think for me, the big concern, you and I spent some time with these folks at Bryce Norton recently, didn't we? Listening to their stories. And the big worry, I think, was, I talk about the Nimrod, because back in the day, Cold War, we were good at this stuff. We were good at tracking them down. And it was one thing, using the aircraft electronics and everything and these sonar buoys, but you needed there was an art of doing this. There was a black arts of how you interpret this stuff. And of course, we had a big gap then when we weren't doing it. I do think it feels like a resurgence, but where is it going? How many more aircraft do we need? Where are the shortcomings? That, for me, is the interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the size of the fleet perhaps in a second, but just going back to your point about skill set, I mean, that is absolutely true. You don't learn overnight to become an expert at tracking submarines under the water. That's a skill you build up over time, listening to all the bleeps and squeaks and goodness knows what other noises. I mean, the Air Force actually, I know this, I was there at the time. When the Nimrod went, we recognised that something was going that was a crazy decision. I think we all recognise that now. We recognised it at the time, to be honest. But there were issues with the MRA4 and therefore what the solution could be. So the Air Force knew that this was going to come back. We didn't know how, we didn't know when, but we knew it was going to come back. We pushed as many of those crews out to a number of nations, both the US, Australia, New Zealand, with Five Eyes, with other MPA capability, and basically had a sea core capability that we left operating out in the wider world. And we managed to bring all those crews back, obviously. And those are now the ones that are building the foundation for the P8 force. And the great thing is a lot of them were flying on P8s prior to them coming across. So we held on to some of that experience, and that has proved to be vital for growing the force again. But yeah, although we're looking at 9 P8s sat there on the pan at Lossiemouth, actually it's the number of crews that you've got that is the real critical factor. And we're not going to go into numbers here, but it won't be a high number. So building that force up now is important. And we know that those 9 can very, very quickly get used up when they're on a week or 2 week long chase of a particular submarine, which is what we saw a few months ago. So yeah, it's a capability that's still quite thin.
It's also, I think, worth pointing out that this is not us being melodramatic about this, that the Russians have the second largest submarine fleet in the world, second only to America. So when we look at, sometimes it's easy to look at Russia and go, oh, it's involved in a war, it's been decimated, it's got no capacity for this, it's not been using its submarines in the war. I was looking at the stats the other day, 64 submarines, 14 nuclear power fast attack, 11 nuclear powered cruise missile, and 23 diesel electric. And these are hovering over regularly things like critical national infrastructure. I keep coming back to that because I was looking, there's over 600 undersea cables around the world that extend over nearly 1 million miles. Now, you just imagine how vulnerable they are. And with these, was it Gigi submarines as well, which is their sort of special intelligence branch, Q branch, as it were, of the Russian subfleet. Some of them can go several kilometers below the ocean. A lot of them need the mothership to be there. But my goodness, have they been working to develop capability to cause havoc? And if we talk about the cyber threat, but if you actually start to sever some of these undersea cables, which most of our internet traffic is carried on, just imagine the carnage that would be wreaked. And therefore, how do we play our part in stopping these submarines? And as I say, for me, it was less about the role of actually hitting them. It was detecting them, because everybody I speak to, once you detect them, they start to run. And therefore, that's where air power has such a critical role. But the numbers, frankly, we are messing around at the moment. And unless we start taking this seriously, it's a really worrying trend for defence. And we're not trying to make a shout out here for the Royal Navy, but I always believe that we need to we're always been a maritime nation. We need a strong Navy, but particularly the Air Force's involvement in this is critical.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. The thing I'd say is the submarines within Russia have always been the thing we've worried about the most, I think. I think they probably worry about NATO air power the most, but I think submarines has always been the thing that NATO has kept most of an eye on. And let's be honest, if a conflict was going to start, I think the indicators would very much come under the surface. You'd see that fleet disperse out, you'd see it disappearing or trying to disappear, and you absolutely might start seeing activity that would start interrupting things under the water. I mean, you're almost in James Bond territory here, aren't you? But it is that kind of capability with giant grabbing jaws and saws and goodness knows what else they're employing under there to cut these cables and to cause mayhem. It is a vital part of what NATO needs to keep an eye on, because it is the threat that is perhaps the least able to deal with. We know how Russia will fight on the land, largely. We largely know how it will fight in the air. Under the surface is something that we don't do or see on a regular basis. And therefore, when it comes, and it's no surprise, is it, that Tom Clancy, when he was writing all his books, Hunt for Red October, Red Storm Rising, it was the underwater stuff where all the interesting and slightly perturbing stuff was going on.
Yeah, and I'm picking up on that theme. I probably wasn't the only person who was somewhat shocked when, I think it's the 6th of March, when the Los Angeles attack class submarine USS Charlotte sort of partially surfaced and sank the Iranian frigate Iris Dina. 2 torpedoes, Mark 48 torpedoes. And we can talk about the scenarios around that, but what a shot to demonstrate just how vulnerable shipping is to a world-class submarine. And I was trying to wrap my brains, the Belgrano was sunk as part of the Falklands campaign, but I don't think we had any video footage from that. Obviously World War II, but it's not often that submarines actually start taking out ships. And it's a really powerful, for me, the tragic loss of life, but also just how quickly a submarine can target, sink, and then disappear again. It is that Tom Clancy feeling, isn't it? Is that sort of, you're looking around, it's a bit like swimming in the ocean, wondering if there's a shark about to get you. It's that same sort of fear. And yeah, I do wonder whether that was a bit of a wake-up call. It certainly got me more reflecting on the power of submarines.
Yeah, I mean, that threat is always there. Once you choose to use that type of an impact, we can argue about the legality or whatever of that particular. And I'm sure that Iranian frigate wasn't expecting that, which is surprising perhaps when what was going on. But yeah, they're like the special forces or the sniper of the maritime world, aren't they? You don't know where they are, and when you know where they are, sometimes it's too late and they're already shooting at you. So yeah, which is why we have to put surface fleets out with so much protection around them in order to protect them. So and if Iran had a more dangerous submarine capability right now, perhaps we wouldn't be seeing the US Navy quite so close. They'd be a lot more worried. I mean, for those that don't know, the Gulf of Arabia is not a good place for submarines. It's not very deep. The way that the thermals work in that part of the world, it's not a place for submarines to hide, which is why they're not really a factor around there. I know Iran have their sort of midget subs, but yeah. So submariners operate in a very different space and in different places, but they are definitely the surprise element. And with Russia, that is a significant surprise element.
So this one of the ways that the nation is looking to deal with this is Atlantic Bastion, isn't it? Which is the sort of Royal Navy. We don't have time or the inclination to sort of go into that in detail. But I guess my point being is that how much of this can be done collaboratively with alliances versus a national capability. Poseidon feels like a really potent capability, still growing because of crews and capability and experience. But how much of this should be done, do you think, as part of an alliance? How much heavily should we be leaning on America, given particularly where we are with NATO at the moment? And are there any other NATO nations that both have the capability and the inclination to get more involved in this capability?
I think all you need to do is look at get a globe and look from the top and look at the way the world is set up and look at where America sits vis-a-vis Russia and China. The high north, the North Pole, isn't just a place where more trade is going to come over time as the ice melts. It is the battlegrounds of the ballistic missile fight. It is where nuclear war would probably be fought. And to that end, it is important to all of us for that reason. And therefore, it is a coalition effort. And you look at the good news is we're particularly within NATO, there's a lot of common procedures, a lot of common equipment, a lot of other P8 operators around us, Norway, Germany, etc. But all the platforms will work together anyway. So what you do have is very much a team effort, which is why you see a lot of those platforms coming up to Lossiemouth and operating from there, or from Iceland, or heaven forbid from Greenland. And I think this is why the conversation that America keeps having about NATO and why Europe should get on with itself is America's front door to Russia and China. It is absolutely vital to them. So it is not in America's interest here to fall out with NATO over collaboration around that part of the world, because it's such a critical part. And if those submarines from the sort of northern fleet of Russia can come around the top of the Norway Kola Peninsula there and get themselves into the North Atlantic undetected, they can cause mayhem. I mean, it's not quite the same as it was in the Second World War with, great large convoys of fleets. So I think we're talking about a war that would go a lot faster than that. But nonetheless, it is what worries America. And the reason it should worry America is once those submarines get into the North Atlantic, America is now a threat. Europe's not even not a factor anymore. Russia can very much circumvent. So, yeah, I think a lot of Americans need to wake up to the geography of this. The idea that Russia is a foe tucked behind Europe is just not true when you look at the North Atlantic.
No, and it's a really good point, isn't it? I mean, the danger is we end up into sort of the world of submarines. But as you say, you can relatively easily detect these submarines being, launched away from their host port. You can then start to track where there are certain points that they go, which are relatively easy to track them. But as soon as you drop into the Atlantic, it's very deep. It's loads of opportunity, unless you can maintain some sort of tracking of them. And there's lots of ways of doing that. But, it is worth pointing out that the people who say it's relatively, there's lots of ways of tracking. You go, well, our fundamental assurance of defence is the continuous at-sea deterrent. And its underlying principle of that is that it's undetectable. Because if it was detectable, then all of a sudden we would not be safe anymore because a first strike could take it out. So there is still this really interesting conundrum that, at its heart, submarines are very difficult to track once you lose sight of them. And therefore, Russia at the moment, by nature of its geography, has to launch these things in a way that we can track them initially, but we need to maintain that. And I think the one thing that Poseidon does is that if there's a sudden opportunity, sudden a need, we can very quickly get an asset to start tracking these things, which if you lose sight of them, really difficult to pick them up again.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about Gwyn Jenkins, First Sea Lord, and his Atlantic Bastion, I mean, the UK's definitely decided to pick this as its special subject to try and, I think, stay relevant within NATO, whereas actually, we're not looking great right now with our spending, etc. So the North Atlantic, and it would be great, of course, if the Royal Navy was at full fighting fitness, and we know that that's not the case right now. So Atlantic Bastion, I doubt that that's very much a sovereign thing, although it's being pitched as such. He was the first one to come up with the term, but we've always had NATO sensors around that part of the world. So is this part, and you and I probably aren't close enough to know the detail, nor should we, but is this part of a NATO network, or will we just dovetail it within the network? How much of this is going to be these unmanned sensors, or are they going to be fixed sensors, literally either floating or fixed on the seabed, in order to detect this activity without having to continuously fly aeroplanes and or sell ships up and down that gap? So yeah, I mean, we don't know the detail, but anything we can do here to effectively create, it won't be an impenetrable boundary. So we're not talking about a fence here, but what we are talking about is a warning network that absolutely picks up activity and then can queue all those other assets, the aircraft, the ships, etc., onto that part of the geography.
So, Greg, another topic that's propped up recently is Firecrest. I'm not a great expert on this. Let me know, what does that entail? And are there any lessons that we can draw from what they're trying to do here for planning for the future?
Yeah, Firecrest is basically the Royal Navy's major deployment this year up into the high north / North Atlantic. Remembering, of course, that the UK has just taken, or is about to take, leadership of JFC Norfolk, Joint Force Command Norfolk, who has a responsibility for that part of the world. So those two things are lining up quite nicely. It was an announcement by the Prime Minister last year, as I said earlier, at the Munich Defence Conference or Security Conference. And it was off the back, of course, of HIMARS. So the Navy was riding high. HIMARS was in the news, announcing another carrier deployment into a part of the world that was important at the time, pre-Iran, was obviously part of the agenda. We couldn't move, if you remember, for ministers jumping up and down in the snow of Norway, etc. It's going to be really interesting to see how Firecrest functions, because that is heavily focused on ASW, and yet we announced the carrier as part of the key part of the deployment. It'll be interesting to see how they choose to use the carrier in an ASW role, which is not something they've really majored on in the past, but is clearly capable of doing it because it can host, in particular, the helicopters is a good example. Interestingly, they've not announced any F-35s that are going to go yet on that deployment. They could, of course, fly out at a moment's notice. I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is I think that force is pretty tired after HIMARS last year, and we've got half a dozen of them deployed into Cyprus, looking after that part of the world. So it just goes to show that air power in the end has to sort of just package up and go wherever it needs to be seen. So yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how Firecrest develops as an ASW package, and how the carrier adapts into that role and how it's used.
I was wondering whether or not it would actually end up deploying, because as a veteran of flying off the old versions of Her Majesty's ships, Illustrious, Invincible and Ark Royal, they really were simply providing protection for the fleet. Their primary role was anti-submarine warfare, but the carriers felt very vulnerable, and therefore you had to have all sorts of other things protecting it for the package. The current versions, the Prince of Wales, the Queen Elizabeth, they are enormous, and the worry is that they present a very, very big target unless they're properly protected. The US has got all the assets available to provide above water and below water protection for them, for their carriers. We don't. And I did wonder whether or not what lessons might be learned by sending one of these flagships into shark-infested custard, which might prove to be folly.
Well, the good news is we're not yet at war with Russia, although I don't think we are anyway. But yes, you are right. When does the hunter become the hunted? And I think there is a paradox here. that you end up defending the carrier from the very submarines you're trying to detect that are going off to do other things. And so you end up, not quite prioritising your effort. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how that comes out. I think, of course, for the Navy, they're a bit trapped right now. They've got the two carriers now that are almost at sea, I think almost simultaneously. It's the one ship they've actually got 100% availability of. Everything else is in a terrible state. So they're obviously going to need allies to come along and help on this. I think we're going to see the P8s heavily involved in the process. And I'm sure Russia would love, wouldn't they, just to pop a submarine up alongside the Prince of Wales at the most embarrassing moment. So yeah, it's going to be a real game of cat and mouse, and we may not ever hear all the stories. But yeah, it is slightly against the grain here of what Prince of Wales was designed for. It's going to be operating a long, long way away from the land predominantly, so the carrier strike role isn't as relevant in this. So would you need F-35s to do fleet defence? Well, the air threat around the part of the North Atlantic isn't great. It's not the sort of aeroplanes that Russia's going to fly over there or things we could intercept quite easily elsewhere. But yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how Firecrest develops. But it is absolutely part of this ASW focus and focus on the High North.
And if you were President Putin, I think you would be commissioning one of your attack submarines to just pop up within a couple of miles with the crosshairs on Prince of Wales, take a picture and drop back down again.
Yeah, I think all submariners live for that moment, whatever side they're on. Yeah.
Anyway, moving on from just a quick look at the Iran war, one thing I'm just intrigued about is that if President Trump's only primary objective was to stop Iran getting nuclear weapons, you either negotiate or you destroy them. He's had a go at Midnight Hammer, destroying them, but it's pretty evident that the jury's out about how much damage was actually done, quite a long way underground. You and I are both weapons instructors, very difficult to tell. You definitely hit the desired mean point of impact, but whether or not the weapon's gone down far enough and actually killed the stuff. I do wonder whether it doesn't look like talks are going well. It doesn't look like Trump's going to get his way. Iran is going to. Do you think there is therefore an opportunity for America to do a sort of Midnight Hammer too, because they must have more intelligence now about what they destroyed, what they simply damaged, and what actually remains unmolested. And as an insurance policy against the talks not going well, what are the prospects, do you think, of doing something like that?
It is so difficult to get ground truth right now, isn't it? I mean, so this is my personal view. I still think Trump needs a deal. He needs a deal, and he needs it quickly for a whole bunch of reasons. Visiting China, the midterms, etc., his current ratings. And I'm not sure America wants to use up too much more of its military power that it's now trying to rapidly rebuild back at home. So I don't think Trump wants that option as much as he might bluster and talk about it to try and frighten Iran, who I don't think are very frightened anymore. I think they're kind of gone, we've seen you worst. Is that the best you got?
Bring it on.
Bring it on. I'm not sure they want to bring it on either, but they can absolutely act like that, can't they? I mean, there are all sorts of stats coming up now about how many of the missiles are now intact, or the launchers are intact, that actually the stuff that was buried is now back out. We saw them recently attack shipping in the Hormuz Strait. So, yeah, I mean, I think even Donald Trump might now be wondering whether some of the bluster that he's been believing, and the likes of Pete Hegseth perhaps doesn't help that actually the targets you think you've hit aren't actually as hit as you thought they were. So the idea, therefore, that you could go back and obliterate them again, having already done it probably at least twice, there's got to be a limitation here on military power as to what you can actually achieve and to what effect. Because if Iran just kicks off again and starts hitting back at the Gulf states, the markets are going to be in more turmoil than they're already in. I think the markets are all hoping here that we're going to get this Hail Mary solution that Trump's going to accept, and we'll go into a long period of negotiation. But yeah, I just can't see a Midnight Hammer 2 really creating much more, whether it be on the conventional side or even on the nuclear side. If Iran hasn't dispersed all that nuclear material and hidden it very, very well, I'll be amazed.
So it then leaves the sort of question of how does it end? Because as we speak, there's still talk about negotiation ongoing, but it does look like just a one-pager, which is almost certainly just a memorandum of understanding. I mean, last time they took this seriously and negotiated, it was 20 months of negotiation. So you're not going to do that in a short timescale. Trump needs to get out faster than that. A memorandum of understanding might allow both sides to go, yeah, we've won, whilst and kicking down the can down the road in terms of, you know, the negotiation, the detail, which quite frankly probably by that stage doesn't matter. Trump will have had his fingers burnt. Iran will feel emboldened, but the Strait of Hormuz will be open again. I do wonder whether or not then the postscript will be, one of the questions I had for you was that, you know, it feels like America's the superpower, you know, bashing Iran every day. But there's been quite a lot of stuff coming out now that Iran has actually been quite successful at striking some American assets, but that America's been a bit circumspect about telling the story about that.
Yeah, we haven't had the full truth, have we, of just how effective Iran was. And let's be honest, I mean, if you were scoring this in a conventional way, if this was a football match or a rugby match, you know, America, you know, won 11-0 or whatever. And if it was rugby, 80-90-0. But the war isn't over. You know, they might have won the battle, and conventionally they might have absolutely achieved domination in most places. And yes, what they've done to Iran is nothing like what Iran has done back to America. But they've hurt them, and they've hit them where it hurts. And that is something that even America now needs to go away and lick its wounds a little bit. But you're right. I cannot see here why the world will want that memorandum to come out. They'll want the 30-day of peace. I think Iran probably does too, if he can get the terms or at least the breathing space to begin to negotiate terms. And I think Trump needs it politically, but I think the challenge for him is how does he sell that as a win? Because that memorandum is going to look an awful lot like the JCPOA that Obama signed in 2015. And the Straits opening is not a success story. They were open 3 months ago. So, yeah, it's really hard here for Trump to come out of this claiming victory. And I think that's the thing we all have to watch.
No, and that's why I wonder whether this meeting, I think Xi Jinping and Trump are due to meet on about the 14th of the month, I think. And you look at the connections here, that China gets about 50% of its oil from Iran. Iran exports about 90% of its oil to China. So there's a really key interest there for China to get the Strait open again. And America and China have a very difficult relationship, but China and America's trade deals, and America needs the rare earth metals and stuff like that China provides. And therefore, I do wonder whether we are in this really bizarre world where China might end up being the answer to the Maiden's Prayer for President Trump, that getting that strategic win you're talking about, because Trump can claim that actually the war forced China to do some more trade deals. China can turn around and say, no, we've transcended America. We're the reasonable party in all this, but it gives an off-ramp to Trump. It'll be fascinating. And my reflection is, you know, the irony here would be that Trump's very aggressive America first policy, dismissing everybody else, just shows the value of diplomacy, but with your friends and your enemies, because you never know when you might need help. And this may be one of those examples.
I remember, I think it was one of our first podcasts, Sean. I have to go back and look. When we interviewed that guy, the American who'd worked in the policy world, who said that, you know, Trump views everything through the China lens. You know, China is the important thing here. The reason he's dealing with Russia the way he's dealing with it is to get Russia to be on his side, to be an ally against China. I mean, I'm not sure that's working out for him. You know, Russia is in a bit of turmoil right now, and Ukraine are sounding like the tough guys in that argument, and Russia's almost irrelevant. You know, whereas it used to have the cards by providing aid and equipment, it's not going to provide any of that now, not very much of it, and therefore, you know, they've lost their influence there even then, and Russia is now very much a paper tiger. So yeah, I'd love to be on a fly on the wall at that meeting with Xi. I mean, how tough China's going to be in that room saying, hey, sunshine, if you think you can muck around with our oil supply any longer, you know, you be careful where you're going with this. So, yeah, that will be fascinating. And I think Trump would very much like to go there with a deal, or at least the beginnings of a deal in place, so that he can say to Xi, don't worry, I've got it, mate. Yeah, I'm going to sort all this out. But, yeah. Well, we all knew it was coming, didn't we?
Yeah, we did, but you know, I'm always minded of keep your friends close, but your enemies closer still. And I do wonder whether Trump's lack of diplomacy, gunboat diplomacy, it is coming back to bite in a way, because these things need to be solved on a multinational basis. It isn't just about Iran. It's going to be about a lot more countries. It'd be fascinating to see how this plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to do the cards analogy again, but yeah, you're right. He has played all his cards, and they're not landing. They're just not landing. And I think the reason that he thinks it's a game of cards, and it's not. It's a game of chess.